Are we almost at? Yeah, so. Hi, folks. It seems as though we are running short on the handouts. So if you can share with the person who's next to you, raise your hand, and Richard or I will come and collect from you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hi, guys. Thank you. Hey.
It's so good to see you.
Good to see you. Well, here's some more for the latecomers. Hi, Evelyn. Nice to see you. Our speaker is here. He's just getting freshened up, so which is important. So, sorry. He is in the white green room, right? So anyway, thank you for your patience. And Chaim, are you happy to use this? Okay. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. It's, we never know what kind of response we're going to get to a program, especially on a Thursday night. It's a weeknight, and it's really a wonderful, wonderful sign of the interest in this topic and in tonight's speaker. I just want to say a couple of words of introduction. First of all, for anybody that I haven't met, I'm Rabbi Steve Cohen from Congregation B'nai B'rith. And the genesis of this particular program came at some point last winter when I was reading the newsletter of the great American Jewish feminist, Letty Pogrebin, she was speaking about her own reactions post October 7th, and it was a dark and in some ways despairing newsletter. But at the end, at the bottom of the newsletter, she said, if you want a ray of hope, click here. And it was taking you to a webinar of this organization, Eretz L'Kulam, A Land for All, and which is the organization that we're going to be learning a little bit about tonight. And Marian and I both watched the entire webinar. It was over an hour, and we were riveted. But the entire thing was introduced by my old friend and teacher, Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller. And for me, that was sort of a hechsher. In other words, it helped me understand that this was a serious and important organization. The fact that Chaim was involved and was willing to come on and introduce it and really lend his name and stature to this organization. Chaim, I've known for almost 40 years. We were both Hillel directors. I was a Hillel director for 19 years at UCSB, and I thought that was a long time. Chaim was the executive director of the Hillel Foundation and the executive director of the Yitzchak Rabin Hillel Center for Jewish Life at UCLA for 40 years. And so he was a giant in the Hillel world. And in fact, at Hillel staff conferences every year, I really looked forward to these Hillel staff conferences. Hillel directors from all over the country would come. It was a very wonderful group of people to be part of. And there were learning sessions offered by all of these different rabbis and teachers. And every year, I would end up going to Chaim's sessions, because he was the one that I was most interested in studying and learning from. But he's not only a giant in the Hillel world, he is truly one of the great teachers and one of the great rabbis of our generation. I'll just tell you a few of the things that he's been involved with. He's now the director emeritus at UCLA Hillel. But he is now, tell me if this is no longer current, but I believe it is. He's the director of the Hartman Fellowship for campus professionals, for Jewish campus professionals. He lectures at UCLA in the Department of Sociology and also the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. He also lectures at Loyola Marymount University in the Department of Theological Studies. He's a faculty member of the Shalom Hartman Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, and also a faculty member of the Wexner Heritage Foundation. These are, the Shalom Hartman Institute and the Wexner Institute are really the leading, I would say, the leading organizations which are training and teaching Jewish leaders for our generation. And Chaim is on the faculty of both of those institutes. He was a founding member of Americans for Peace Now. And I'll just close with the last thing on the biography that I found online, which is something that I've known but is of great interest. He was the rabbinic consultant to Barbra Streisand during the making of the film Yentl. So, you know, in some ways, like the other stuff is, right. Okay, so anyway, and he has come up and taught for us many, many, many times, and every time after the program, people just want more. So it really gives me great honor and pleasure to reintroduce to our community Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller.
Thank you. It's good to be back. I guess this is somewhere near where the synagogue is, so I'm happy to be here, and to be introduced. You know, we started off with studying Torah, and we ended off with Hollywood. I guess that's a success story. I don't know. To me, that's the wrong direction. Well, I hope we would go in the other direction. I'm happy that I'm appearing here under the supervision, the hechsher that Steve has you have given me, actually. And I hope that when I leave here tonight, I'll still be kosher. So don't slaughter me unnecessarily. Because there are some things that I imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, that I'll say that might be provocative. So please respond appropriately. Because actually the reason I say that is that I come here wanting really to teach and to learn, and the subject at hand drives us into a political discussion in part, so we're going to have to deal with some politics. I want to contextualize it. That's why I want to begin with some sources and some teaching. And I'm going to start with a quote that you don't have from a teacher of mine, from Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, and you can access this actually online. That's how I came to it. It was presented in 1958, and I had my son on this, and he's a researcher, and we know that it was presented in '58. We have the recording, but we don't know the audience to which it was presented. So it was a talk. One of the things that's significant about it is that it's a talk in English. In those days, he was lecturing mostly when he taught at the yeshiva, he was teaching in Yiddish. In my day, I started studying with him in 1967. He was already teaching us in English. So this dates back to 1958. It looks like it was to some Jewish labor group, perhaps, which is fascinating that he made this presentation. And he said the following. So this is really I would say, the premier leader of modern Orthodoxy in America, and a great, not only a leader of a community, but I would say the most important Talmudist of our generation. With a very sort of fine and deep background in philosophic studies, had completed his research in Germany before he came to the United States. So Soloveitchik writes the following: "The Jew has experienced persecution and brutality. We never had a state. We never had political power. What if we had been a state in the Middle Ages? How would we have acted? Just like the feudal lords? Or would we have acted differently because of Jewish values? Who knows? Now with the state of Israel, the test has come. We are facing the test. Will we behave like any other state, ethically? Will we restrain ourselves from engaging in certain injustices, so to say practices which are in conflict with basic Jewish ethics? Or will we yield to temptation?" Rabbi Soloveitchik continued, Here we have an opportunity. The Jews are the rulers. They legislate the laws. They are, so to say, the masters. Will we act like masters? Or will we understand that Judaism doesn't know the concept of master and slave, victor and vanquished, powerful and weak? This is my problem with regards to the state of Israel. The whole of Jewish history will be interpreted in terms of what the state of Israel will do in the next 50 years. If the state of Israel doesn't live up to Jewish ethics, people will reinterpret Jewish history in a whole different light. The question is not whether Israel will defeat the Arabs on the field of battle, but whether we will defeat our evil within our own community and be victorious in this field. To me, this is the most important problem. So, in the midst of the most trying period that we've had as Jews in our lifetimes, I think we are tonight going to engage in a little bit of sort of cheshbon hanefesh accounting, self-accounting, and talk about not only criticism, but also about new possibilities. That's something that I've looked for. When Steve mentioned, when Rabbi Cohen mentioned that I gave a hechsher and so on, so I think it's important for me to tell you, I've been a person of the left, the moderate left, in terms of politics all my adult life. I don't know what I was like when I was at yeshiva, even there at yeshiva, I would say. My roommate tells me that I put up a poster of a mushroom cloud over my bed. So that was sort of haunting me, I guess, in the 60s. So that I had some political awareness. But in all of my work on behalf of Israel and with organizations that were left of center, I always tried to be associated with groups that I would identify to be Zionists. That was very important for me, that the groups that are going to be critical are also engaged in a constructive way with the project, with the national project of the Jewish people. In fact, the image that I would draw for you is one where we need to be able to be both lovers and critics simultaneously. We've thoroughly failed in transmitting that to young people. They don't know about that. They don't know that it's possible. Maybe they don't see their parents doing it. So they never learned that you could be lovingly engaged and a critic at the same time. On the contrary, now they live in a binary world where either you're good or evil, and they have to either accept or reject. And they can't hold two contradictory things at the same time. That's a problem in education and the inability to think in a creative way. It's a total failure as far as I'm concerned. It's basic in order to be able to make progress, to be able to hold on to two things that are not necessarily in agreement with one another. We are Jews, we are both particularists and universalists simultaneously, even though those categories seem to contradict one another. We say it a few times a day in Aleinu L'Shabeach. We are who we are, a distinct people, and we pray for universal redemption at the same time. And we have to take our tradition seriously in terms of educating us how to navigate and hold on to these things. So this is sort of by way of introduction in terms of where we're going to go. And now, let's go. So you have some sources in your hands. We're not going to read all of them. We can't because we have to move on. But I do want to read a couple of them before we begin, as I said, to provide some context. So on the second page, in the middle of the page, you have a midrash that's termed Tanchuma Mishpatim 1. So this is a classic text. It's a wonderful text. It's based on the teaching at the top of the page, when you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless help raise it. Right? So your enemy's ass has been down by its burden, by its load. You have to help unburden the ass and get your enemy's ass on its legs to be able to do so and help him out. In Deuteronomy, we read a second verse, similar in its intent. If you see your fellow Israelite's ass, not your enemy's ass, or ox fallen on the road, actually the Hebrew word there is achicha, your brother's ass, rather than narrowly defined Israelite, do not ignore it, you must raise it together. All right? It's going to be relevant when I think I want to make a connection between the two verses, one in Exodus and the other in Deuteronomy. So the Midrash says as follows: what is meant by thou hast established equity? Rabbi Alexandri explained it as follows: two mule drivers who despise each other are walking along a road. Suddenly, one of the mules falls to the ground. As the one who is leading the second mule passes by, he sees the mule of the other man stretched out beneath his load, and he says to himself, is it not written, you can imagine this, you're walking on the road, and the person says, oh, didn't I learn in the Torah that it said this? I mean, this is a normal story. It happens every day that people think this way. Is it not written in the law that if thou seest the ass of him that hateth, especially someone speaking English like this, the law that if you see the ass of someone that hates you lying under its burden, you shall forbear to pass him by. You shall not pass him by. That you shall verily release it for him. What did he do? This second mule driver, he turned back to help the other person reload his mule, and then accompanied him on the way, because the verse says you have to do that. You have to help him. In fact, while working with him, he began to talk to the owner of the mule, saying, let's loosen it a little on this side. Let's tighten it down on this side, until he reloaded the animal with him. It came to pass that they had made peace between themselves. The driver of the mule that had fallen said to himself, I cannot believe that he hates me. See how concerned he was when he saw that my mule and I were in distress. As a result, they went into the inn and ate and drank together. Finally, they became extremely attached to each other. Hence, thou hast established equity. Thou hast executed justice and righteousness. And hence, as I say, the difference between the verse in Exodus and the verse in Deuteronomy. In Exodus, they were enemies, but then they had a drink. So by the time they got to Deuteronomy, they became brothers. All right? So here the Torah lays out a formula. The person that you dislike, that you most probably don't know, you might know that person's politics, and therefore you identify them or you stereotype them in a particular way. You don't know that person, but you know what? If you took the time to look at them, to see their eyes, and to talk to them, maybe you can overcome the differences between you. And maybe you can shatter those boundaries. In fact, that's how I understand what goes on campus today. I'm sorry, I have to speak in the mic. Yeah, I'm sorry, I wander. I'm the classic wandering Jew. I can't help it. So in other words, I understand the students who are involved in their what they call anti-normalization. They refuse to speak to any groups that are identified, or individuals who are identified with Zionist groups. Right? So they don't want to talk to them. Why don't they want to talk to them? It's scary to talk to someone with whom you differ, because you might find that maybe you actually can get along, or if not get along with that person, they have something to say, God forbid. And rather than listen to what they might say, you want to block them out. So that's what the Torah is doing, trying to get us to crack through the wall that we erect to protect ourselves from hearing what's different and what's uncomfortable. Because we might, in effect, be changed by what we hear. Both of us might be changed as a result. All right, so that's text number one. I think, in other words, the author, what you have to do when you read rabbinic texts like this is is at least appreciate the rabbinic psychology. They had a really good sense of human nature and how human nature operates. And they were looking not only to tell you what the law says, but how human beings should behave, what character they should develop, how we should be able to see the humanity of each other. A great Jewish teacher, I call him, even though he was not a Zionist, in fact some would term him as anti-Zionist, was a literary critic, a British literary critic named George Steiner. On the bottom of the next page you have a text that he wrote. It's part of an essay that I recommend that you all read. It's an essay called Our Homeland, the Text, in which Steiner explains the nature of Jewish survival. We survived as a people through the centuries without sovereignty, without a temple, without the sense, the dignity of nationhood, because we had a substitute for our temple. We had a substitute for our nation. It was the book. We invested in the book, and we lived in the book, with the book, and it gave us life. And the tension in Jewish tradition, at least as it's represented by the rabbis in another wonderful and outstandingly insightful midrash, is that the book and the sword descended together, interwoven. And the question becomes whether the book and the sword are going to operate together, whether the sword is going to overwhelm the book, or maybe if the book will overwhelm the sword. So Steiner was one in favor of the book overwhelming the sword. That's why he was not, he couldn't allow himself to be a Zionist in that regard. But I always say that you need to listen to people, right, as I just said, even people with whom you differ. I don't accept Steiner's, he passed away, his rejection of Zionism, but he has some wise things to say, to teach us. We do him a disservice and ourselves a disservice when we take people like Steiner and we classify them as anti-Semites because they're anti-Zionist. Because what we do when they classify them as anti-Semites is that we make them, if Rabbi Cohen can make me kosher, so we make Steiner treif. He's treif. Don't touch him. Don't even read what he has to say. And we are the ones who lose out because Steiner is wise. And look what he says. I cannot shake off the conviction in the midst of this essay. It's a long essay. I cannot shake off the conviction that the torment and the mystery of resilience in Judaism exemplify and act an arduous truth that human beings must learn to be each other's guests on this small planet, even as they must learn to be guests of being itself and of the natural world. This is a truth humbly immediate to our breath, to our skin, to the passing shadow we cast on a ground inconceivably more ancient than our visitation. And it is also a terribly abstract, morally and psychologically exigent truth. Look at how he writes. Humans will have to learn it, or we will be made extinct in suicidal waste and violence. What if everybody in the world understood that their presence is that of a stranger? We all come from somewhere else. Of late, I've actually, I know that this is not very popular, but I'm very suspicious of the notion of indigeneity. Who's indigenous? I know there are people who lived here long before we did, but they also came. They came across the Bering Straits, right? They didn't come here. They're not of the land. They don't own the land. The land is very important to them. I don't want to disagree. I don't want to start up with Native Americans. Because they've been abused sufficiently. But I want us to think to ourselves, what does it mean to be indigenous? Who came first? There was always someone before that. And where did we come from? We all came from a womb. Strangers into the world that we entered. We all need to understand that. It'll give us a basic sense of our vulnerability as human beings. No one is a master, and Steiner's not a religious personality, but he writes within the context of a religious understanding that this is God's earth. Last week we read in the Torah portion, Ki li haaretz, the earth is mine. Ki atem gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. You are resident strangers with me. In my world that I created, no one is an owner. Others, people may possess, but the possession is fleeting as we fleet through the world. The perpetual, permanent owner is the divine owner. Can you imagine a world where we had such a consciousness and people could interact with that understanding and negotiate against the background where they don't see themselves as the Baalim, the Hebrew word Baal, master, right? I know it's used for husband, all right, and excuse me, but who is it? Is it Hosea? Is it Hosea who says that in the end of days you will no longer call me Baal, but Ishi, but my man, right? So even the prophet understands that the Hebrew word for husband is fraught, right? When we attach it to the notion of mastery, but there's no mastery. Soloveitchik is right. That's not the way to engage the world. Because people who engage the world out of a sense of mastery master not only the land, they master the people on the land. They dominate and they persecute. And so the religious tradition has to be one that moves us away from that notion of mastery. So this is my introduction to Eretz L'Kulam. So in pursuing, in Hebrew, Eretz L'Kulam, a land for all, sometimes it's abbreviated these days as Alpha, but initially, the name of the movement was One Homeland, Two States. And I want you to hear that. One homeland, two states. Why one homeland? Because you have two peoples from the river to the sea who both share the same homeland. And it's about time that we recognize that. In fact, we know that, they know that, everybody knows that, except the ones who don't want to know that. And this is the consciousness that informs the movement. We have a history on the highlands of Hebron and Nablus and Shechem. That's where our ancestors lived. They have a history in Akko and Haifa on the coast. Haifa and Akko are part of the state of Israel. Hebron and Shechem are part of the West Bank. Our hearts are in all places. How do we live together? How do we make it work? If we split it, we're splitting our hearts. If we recognize that we have a relationship to all, then we can get along, maybe we can get along with one another. So you'll hear from me what that plan is. That's some of the background that brings us to a land for all. But I want to tell you something about my own involvement. Number one, since the 70s, it's a long time, right? We understood, a group of us, that we had to talk to Palestinians at a time that no one was talking to Palestinians. We also understood there was something bad about the occupation. Do you know that Ben-Gurion, he died a few years later, but in September of 1967, gave a major talk to the Labor Party at that time, in which he recommended that we give it all up, in September 1967. Do you know that at the meeting at which the cabinet decided in 1967 to respond to the Jordanian attack on Jerusalem, the Jordanians were lobbing artillery shells into Jerusalem because they were convinced by Nasser to join the war, even though they were reluctant and really it was not their game. Nevertheless, they did lob in these artillery shells, and there was an emergency meeting of the Israeli cabinet to decide how to respond. There were only 2 negative votes at that time against a formal military response. And those two votes were by the religious ministers in the cabinet. And the reason they voted against a response to Jordan was they said, what are we going to do with it when we conquer it? Why did they ask that question? Because there was no plan. And you know what happens when you engage in a military adventure without having a plan? And you're victorious. That's even worse in a way, if you think about it. Because we conquered the territory and we didn't know what to expect or what to do, and we had no plan for the future. And we let it ride. And it reached up to the point fairly recently where we began to accept the notion that we could manage the conflict. That's like, that's like saying, all right, come get us, we're managing the conflict. Right, that's what we did, and they came and got us while we were managing the conflict. I mean, it's a complete failure, because you can't suppress people and manage a conflict and imagine that it's going to go away. Ahad Ha'am recognized this in his first visit to Palestine in 1891. You know what Ahad Ha'am was? He was one of the founding Zionist theoreticians. He opposed Herzl's political agenda, but he promoted a cultural agenda and the revival of the Jewish people through culture and language, etc. And he came eventually to live in Tel Aviv in his last years himself, and he was a major promoter of the Zionist project. But in 1891, he visited the settlements in Palestine, and he said, I see our Jews who just immigrated from Europe where they were persecuted, and I see what they're doing. They're beating these Arabs. They're buying up the territory, fine, they're growing, they're working hard, but at the same time, they're belittling the people they're working with. The Arabs are taking it because they have no ability to respond. And yes, and they're right, the Arabs only understand power, but don't forget this. They're not going to forget what you did to them. And when they come back, we'll have to pay for it. Don't behave what the phrase that Achad Ha'am used, which appears again and again in Hebrew literature and as a critique, is a verse from Proverbs, Eved ki yimloch, when a slave becomes a king. Don't behave like a slave that became a king, like the abused child who then abuses others. Understand that as a Jew, you have to transcend that impulse, that instinctive impulse, to wreak vengeance because you are the ones you suffered, and you're going to give it back. So Achad Ha'am already leveled that criticism against the immigrants to Palestine in 1891, but no one paid attention. He wasn't the only one. There were a few people. There were a few examples of writers, some who were sent by the Zionist executive to investigate and check up. But you remember Ari Shavitz's first chapter about his grandfather, the great Zionist, Norman Bentwich, who drove through the whole land of Israel and didn't know that there was another people living there. All right? That's the way it was. All right. So Achad Ha'am tried to make us aware. So we're aware that there's another people, and that and as I said, early on, people like Ben Gurion, people like Isaiah Leibovitz, they advised the government to just give it up and not attempt to control the territories where the Palestinians lived. But we decided to occupy those territories. All right, there was no peace, so we occupy. So I'm going to read you something that I wrote at the 40th anniversary of the occupation, because it's still relevant. It's now 57 years. And one has to say that the occupation has been a total catastrophe. Number one, here I have 13 propositions. Yeshayahu Leibovitz was right, as was Ben Gurion. Both predicted that ruling over a recalcitrant Arab civilian population would corrupt the Israeli people, who would be cast into the role of occupiers. Two, our Zionist dream of building a liberal democracy grounded in the Judaic prophetic tradition that recognizes the image of God in every human being has been compromised by the settlement movement. Even if you accept the arguable assertion that there never was a possibility for a negotiated settlement, it was absolutely unnecessary for Israel to engage in a settlement initiative. Security is maintained by an army, not by civilian outposts, towns, and cities implanted amidst the hostile Palestinian population. There were two options: pursuit of a settlement, negotiated, or of settlements. Israel chose to focus its energy, financial, military, infrastructure development, human resources on the latter, on settlements, not on a settlement. Three, the settlements and the occupation that they entail are an illegal endeavor that has earned the scorn of all democratic countries and has been judged to be a violation of the Geneva Convention by all but a handful of international legal scholars, thereby rendering Israel an international outlaw. That's before this recent onslaught. And if you follow the news, you know that one of the judges in the International Tribunal of the ICC is a Holocaust survivor, a professor who was a professor of law, and an ambassador, an Israeli ambassador, before he was hired to be an international law professor at NYU. Right? And so this person early on wrote what is now, I guess, a buried decision, or I don't know if it's a decision. What happens with a legal opinion? A legal opinion for the government of Israel, when he worked for the government of Israel, in which he demonstrated clearly that the settlements were illegal and that the Israeli Supreme Court should recognize them as illegal, which it did not do. Even though as I understand, there are some motions, I mean, it's complicated. But we've gone on, and all of you've heard speakers, I don't know whether they were brought to your synagogue, but they were certainly brought to the community, trying to convince you that they are legal, that we have scholars, and it's okay not to worry about it. Well, we didn't worry about it. And you pay for things that you don't worry about. Justice for the Palestinians within the occupied territories is determined by the military and not by Israel's democratic law. In practical terms, this means that within the territories controlled by Israel on the West Bank, two systems of justice are employed: one for the Israeli settlers, Israeli law, and one for the occupied population. I don't know what you call this, but there are names for such a legal structure. In addition, there are now separate roads for use, only by Israelis to protect them from Palestinian ambush. All of the above calls into question and may well undermine Israel's claim to being the only functioning democracy in the Middle East. The settlements have raised doubts as to the legitimacy, number 5, of the State of Israel. This is very significant. By claiming that Ofra and Shiloh, 2 settlements on the West Bank, are the equivalent of Haifa and Tel Aviv, the irresponsible messianists and government officials who mouth these inanities have reopened the argument over the partition agreement, which is the internationally recognized basis for the establishment of the state. Do you understand that we are responsible for delegitimizing Israel? We blame everybody else, but we embrace the idea that Ofra, a settlement, is like Haifa. Well, if Ofra is like Haifa, and Ofra is illegitimate and illegal because it's a settlement, then Haifa is illegal because it's a settlement. And that's what they say. And we're the ones who say that. How dare we? And how dare we accept it without a response? And we've let it slide all these years. The demographic time bomb argument, number 6, is itself an indicator of the ethical taint that the occupation has occasioned. We justify a compromise proposal not on the moral grounds that Palestinians are due a national entity, just as we are, which is a good argument to make, but because Palestinians as an ethnic group represent a demographic threat to Israel's Jewish majority. Implicit in this claim, of course, is the understanding that if this were not so, we would certainly keep it all. Number 7, the settlement movement was initiated by Messianic zealots, whose apocalyptic thinking has permeated all sectors of Judaism today, especially, including the secular. It has fomented violence, inured Israelis to the humiliation of another people, and led some Jews to promote murder in the name of God. 8, the occupation has had a devastating effect on the Israeli military, turning a once vaunted force into little more than a police riot squad, and thus impairing the IDF's performance in Lebanon. I wrote this in, 17 years ago. It has also transformed every Israeli 18-year-old willy-nilly into a perceived oppressor. The occupation, number 9, has left a trail of abuse and persecution: house demolitions, late-night searches, land confiscation, destruction of olive groves, etc. How many of you have said anything about this? Leading to the gradual dissolution of the Palestinian way of life. It has succeeded in creating a new generation of Arabs that hates Israel with unprecedented ferocity. 10, we, the people who enshrine human rights in our classic teachings, have, as a result of the occupation and its ensuing policies. By the way, I know I haven't said this. This doesn't mean that the other side is good. This doesn't mean that they haven't committed terror acts, atrocities, that they haven't tried to kill us, that they're willing to settle with us. This is only about us and what we've done. And I know that it's hard to separate the two, but this is a policy of a government that's unnecessary, meaning you could have had an army in place on the boundaries without moving, as I said early on in these remarks, without moving civilians into settlements so that they abut the living spaces of the Palestinians, and so that the army has to take measures that limit the freedom of the Palestinians and oppress them. That was unnecessary. We could have maintained our security all these years. Let's say we wouldn't have given up the West Bank, right? So we have soldiers on the boundaries. That's what you do when there's no peace. You don't move in civilian populations. That's a violation of the Geneva Accord. And don't tell me that there's no state there and therefore it's not a violation. That's, legal hogwash. I'm sorry. Legalities, we can make all the legal arguments we want. And I'm sorry, we sound, I don't want to insult us. I mean, it's an insult to think about that we, for the sake of a legal argument, we override a moral precept. There's a moral consideration here that's far more significant than arguing that we're right. We, the people who enshrine human rights in our classic teachings, have, as a result of the occupation and its ensuing policies, become a universal human rights offender, castigated again and again by respectable organizations, including our own. Number 11, the occupation has made us a more parochial people, introducing a fearful sense of isolation and abandonment that has occasioned, in turn, the narrowing of our Jewish vision. 12, the period from 48 to 67 established Israel as a fact. The interval between 1967 and 2007 has established that the freedom and dignity of Israel's citizens is incomplete, I would say until 2024, is incomplete as long as there is no concomitant freedom and dignity for Palestinians. I hope we understand that. Israel is not a free country until the Palestinians are a free country. We can't imagine that we're going to live in freedom. We live in terror instead of in freedom, unfortunately. 13, a concluding thought. 40 years ago, 57 years ago, Menachem Begin sent his friend Harry Horowitz to the U.S. to unfold the settlement plan before the American Jewish community. At a presentation that he made to the Federation board members in Los Angeles, I was present, the assembled guests sat impassively and listened, not reacting at all. No one flinched as the details were laid out fully with maps and charts. In other words, we sat idly by with our hands on our hands. We must then accept part of the blame for destroying the dream of an Israel that is the fulfillment of the prophetic vision of a land flowing with justice and with righteousness. The occupation, I said then, is the greatest catastrophe to befall the Jewish people in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The settlers and the compliant Israeli governments that have supported them have succeeded in overturning 2,000 years of a tradition of justice for the other and in transforming the Jewish people into an oppressive occupier. The settlement movement has corrupted the people of Israel to the point that the ideals that inspired the creation of Israel have withered, and the moral voice of the Jewish tradition has been compromised. The occupation is the most un-Jewish of projects, and from a religious perspective, it's a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of the divine name. We all bear the burden of guilt and can gain, I'm sorry for the religious language, atonement, forgiveness by devoting our considerable energies to the struggle to end the occupation. Otherwise, into the future, the state of Israel will remain as a reminder to humanity, not that a people has risen from the ashes with a vision of hope and justice, but that given the opportunity, the Jewish people has acted no differently from any other conquering power. So, this is the background. I'm looking for a way out. This weighs on me, right? I tried to publish it again and revise it, and my I don't know what to call him. Anyway, he told me, don't publish it, they'll fire you right away, and so on. When I first published it, no one paid attention. And it was published in a very small journal, and I think people ignored it. That's part of the problem that we're faced with. So this is what I carry that burden on my back. Secondly, I work with young Jews, and I hear again and again and again from them, not only about their disappointments, but about their alienation. I was once walking the streets of New York with my daughter on a Friday night. We had a long walk, and she does a lot of work in the Jewish community and has many connections with young people. And I'm a little bit, I'm white-haired, you know. I do try to meet with students to this day, you know, but I'm of another generation, and they look at me sometimes as if I'm a little weird. So I said to Shuli, I said, tell me, Shuli, do you know any young Jews, this goes back 10 years, who want a divorce from Israel? And she said, no, because that's what I started feeling. And that's the reality now. There's an entire domain of young Jews who want to create a Jewish life. They're not abandoning Judaism. They're not assimilationists. They're not turning their back. They want to be Jewish. They don't want to have anything to do with Israel. And they want to make a new life for themselves. It's very scary. Right? It's the mirror image of, let's say, what the early Zionists wanted to do. They wanted to create a Zionism without Judaism. Young Jews wanted Judaism without Zionism. And I actually was reading just this afternoon a little piece that was written by a former student. Dear Israel, end the occupation or force a generation of Jews to abandon Zionism. Why should I be expected to blindly align myself with an alleged democracy that is unable to respect the rights of all people in the name of Zionism? The Israeli government is distorting the concept of Zionism to the point where it is unidentifiable to me. As long as the right remains in power and maintains control over the narrative going forward, people like me will have an increasingly difficult time resonating with modern-day Zionism, something that should be prevented while it is still possible. Thank God she wants to prevent it. I want to see myself represented within the only country in the world that I can ethnically align myself with. However, I shouldn't be expected to sacrifice ethics for ethnicity. Ethics for ethnicity. As someone who, according to all demographic information, should be a strong-willed and passionate Zionist, I find myself with a weak and conditional sense of Zionism and a yearning for a nation of the past that I was never even alive to see. That is why it is more important now than ever that we look to create a progressive and inclusive future for Israel that does not isolate itself from those who should be able to support it. That's what this is about. That's what I'm going to try to talk about tonight. All right? I want to try to talk about a progressive, constructive, positive vision. I'm tired of being a critic. I'm tired of being left out of discussions, but people see me, you know, as here he comes again. You know, I want to be part of the building, and I want to overcome the split in our community. What we have now is we have the problem of occupation. We have the problem of young Jews who are increasingly alienated. We have a riven Jewish community. We have rabbis who are paralyzed because they can't talk about the ethical dimensions of the problem because they're afraid to lose their jobs. And this is true all over the country, no matter how many times the editors of all sorts of journals claim that there's complete freedom of speech in the Jewish community. Of course there's freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want and then you lose your job. That's, I mean, that's the reality. In addition, I have written down increasing public, not increasing, there is public hostility and condemnation and damnation of Israel in all circles. One thing my friend told me Bibi has been most successful in doing is he's united the entire world in their anti-Semitism against the Jews. It's a great achievement. Right? American politics is divided by Israel. The next election is going to play a role, it may play a role in the next election. There's an abiding sense of hopelessness in the Jewish community. What is the future? Is there a voice for with a constructive idea? Is there hope at all? Or is it the end? There are people who are talking about the end. I'm on the phone every week. I study every week, twice with someone in Israel, and he tells, one of my chavrutot tells me that he made Aliyah. He's an American who made Aliyah, and for the first time in his life, he's just worried. Is he going to continue? How can he continue? He doesn't know. He doesn't know. I mean, he will. I know he will. But he's not the only one who's talking like this, right? The country, and there was an article in Eretz a couple of weeks ago by, I think they were two economists, in which they predicted that Israel will not reach its 100th birthday because, this was their reasoning, because there are three populations that don't contribute positively to the ongoing government, the ongoing economy of Israel. One is the Haredi population, the other is the Arab population, and the third population is the Haredim, the Arabs, and the settlers. Of course, the settlers are a drain, and not only a drain. Did you read I didn't read the whole thing. Did you read the New York Times last week? You're not boycotting the New York Times here, are you? And I know you have a very good Santa Barbara paper here, and a wonderful editor. I know, I heard all about it. But you got to read the New York Times. By the way, this is also something that I never imagined. Intelligent Jews, my friends, boycott the New York Times because it's anti-Israel. They don't listen to NPR because it's anti-Israel. I mean, this is sort of a know-nothingism that's alive in Jewish life. Where does it come from? I don't understand it. You know, I get upset too when I read articles that I don't agree with, but I don't stop reading. The paper is a rich resource. So the entire magazine was devoted to a study of the settler movement and how it's undermined the government of Israel, how it's dragged it down, how it's introduced lawlessness. I mean, we have to be aware of this. Finally, be aware of what's going on under our noses. So what led to this immediate effort? I'm sorry, I know that I'm going on. I haven't timed myself at all. But it's a long story, and we have to get... So I'm going to give you just a few more moments on the background, which is that Peter Beinart, who's a friend of mine, I had been in conversation with him at the time that Bibi was talking about annexing the West Bank, and I asked him, what are we doing about it? He said he's writing an article. So I looked forward to the article, and the article appeared. There was a long article that he wrote in Jewish Currents, and then an abridged version in the New York Times, and the headline was, "I no longer need a Jewish state." You know, and in Yiddish we say, "Mir hat nicht gut geworden." In other words, inside, it was as if there was a rot inside. This is Peter declaring to the world, I no longer need a Jewish state. I'm not a Zionist. Even though he claimed to be a liberal Zionist, and Peter is a person who has a following. He's the leader of these young Jews who want the divorce. Even though he's not appointed, even though, I mean, I don't know, you know, but I would say, intellectually, he is their leader. So in the face of such a column, I called my friend in New York, Rabbi Roli Matolo, and I said, Roli, what are we going to do? So he said, did you see the letter that Art Green, another friend of ours, had written, an open letter to Peter Beinart? And I said, no, and he sent it to me. And I read the letter. In the letter, Green makes reference to the fact that he spends part of every year in Israel, and during the course of his last visit to Israel, he attended some meetings of Eretz L'Kulam, of a land for all. And all of a sudden, he saw a bright light, and that this was a possibility. I had met the people from a land for all some years earlier, and my reaction was, they're dreamers, it's impossible, what are they talking about? And then when Green made reference to it, I said, that's what we need. So I started to call all the people that I knew who might be sympathetic. Lady Pogrebin, Michael Walzer, I mean, people that, let's get together, let's start some conversation. We need to create a support group for a land for all, for Eretz L'Kulam, and be able to translate their vision of two states and one homeland to the American people, American Jews, and make this into a living political proposal. What we all understood was separation, the idea that what we're going to do in order to live in peace is separate the Palestinian people and the Jewish people has failed. I know that it's hard to hear that today, given what the Palestinians did, the Gazan Palestinians. But the director of Eretz L'Kulam, Mai Pundak, who's the daughter, by the way, of Ram Pundak, who negotiated the Oslo agreements, right? So Mai said something very wise. The only example of a successful coexistence of Palestinians and Jews is where? In the state of Israel, exactly. That's what we should know. The Palestinians who live on the West Bank are the same Palestinians that live in Israel. I mean, they lived under hardship, so they've gone through, they're in a different place. But at least, I mean, but they stem from the same background. Their character is not naturally any different. If we can get along and create a way of living, and actually improvement, not only integration, 25% of the doctors in Israel today, I think at least 40% of the medical personnel are Palestinian in Israel today. And the Technion, I think 25% of the Technion is, or more, is Palestinian. I mean, and the Palestinians are only 20% of the Israeli population. You know, so there are fields in which Palestinians have been totally involved, and they feel more Israeli. It doesn't mean they don't resent the Israeli government. It doesn't mean that there aren't prejudices, but they understand the fact that they live in Israel, and it's a value for them. And in all the surveys of happiness, you know the survey, then Israel always comes out very high, right? And the Palestinians living in Israel agree that they're happier in Israel. So we have a model of coexistence. That's what we have to draw on, not on the failed models that cause separation and that cause us to police them, all right, in order to preserve our security. By the way, we also have security. You're worried about security? For how many years is it now? I don't know how many years the Israeli security and the Palestinian Authority security have worked hand in hand to avoid suicide bombing. And with the Palestinian Authority handing in Palestinians, right? Because they want to avoid terrorism at all costs. I mean, I don't know the nature of the arrangement, but I do know that it works, and there can be security. So don't tell me that it's impossible to work out a security with the Palestinians. So what is the program? The vision is based on true partnership and mutuality, from separation to partnership. The Jewish partner who founded A Land for All worked with a Palestinian partner. The Jewish partner is a journalist by the name of Meron Rappaport. He's not the director, he is the thinker, and the Palestinian partner is I'm forgetting his name now. He was Arafat's secretary. Right? So the Palestinian who's involved with this is someone with standing in the Palestinian community. This is not an effort of many Jews and a few Palestinians. There is a board comprised of 7 Jewish members and 7 Palestinian members. There are co-directors, Mai Pundak, the Jewish co-director, and what's her name? Rula Hardal, the Palestinian co-director. She's a professor and a fellow at the Hartman Institute. All right. She lives on the West Bank. So we have an effort. On the board of directors is a friend of mine. Of course, we're working on developing a Palestinian cohort here in America named Omar Dajani, who's a professor of law in San Francisco. He's committed, he's on the board, he's committed full-heartedly to this proposal as the proposal that could bring resolution. When Palestinians hear 2 states, usually they're suspicious. 2 states means the control of the Jews, as far as they're concerned. This proposal avoids that because it's 2 states with open borders. That's why it's a vision. It's not something that we can begin immediately. We have to work towards this vision. But it understands that these 2 people live side by side. They live side by side now. They're going to continue to live side by side into the future. How can we make it that they coexist rather than that they exist as enemies? So it's a vision of true partnership and of equal national rights, grounded in the following values: dignity, equality, coexistence, mutual respect, justice, and recognition, that both peoples have a deep connection to the land, as well as historical rights. When Michal Fruman, who lives in Tekoa, a West Bank settlement, who had been stabbed by an Arab terrorist while carrying a child, both she and the child survived. When I heard her in a seminar say the following: when I say to my Palestinian neighbor, remember she lives on the West Bank, when I say to my Palestinian neighbor that I recognize and I understand that you love the land like I love the land, and that you have rights to this land like I have rights to this land, all the hostility melts, and we begin to talk as neighbors. Maybe it's not so simple, and maybe saying that is not so simple, but understanding that is the beginning. There are 2 narratives, 2 stories, 2 people who live in the same land. We've known that for years. Amos Oz wrote about it. Aleph Bet Yoshua wrote, the great writers in Israel wrote about it. Amos Oz was a separationist. He believed that there had to be a divorce. We went through that. I think that we need something new. That's the point. We need a new idea. We need some excitement. We need new possibilities. When this war started, I know I'm not going to comment too much on the war, but I just say one thing. When this war began, I said to myself, we did this already once before. We did this already twice before. We did this already 3 times before, and it hasn't worked. We're going to do it again. When do we learn? Right. So when do we stop doing the same thing and understand we have to adjust, we have to adapt, we're creative. That's who we are. That's how we survived all these years. What are the elements of the program for 2 states, 1 homeland? Number 1, 2 sovereign states based on the 67 boundaries. I guess there could be some adjustments. All right, open borders. Right, that's really an important dimension. Open borders. Right, there needs to be a sense of mutual recognition. Eretz Yisrael is the Jewish homeland, and Palestine is a Palestinian homeland. And that, by the way, was the decision of the United Nations Partition Agreement, that there should be two states. They rejected it, right? We got to know the history. They paid for it, but now it's time that we don't have to, that we shouldn't be paying for it. I mean, we're basically paying for their mistake. I know that. I resent it. Why didn't they accept it? But I want to do something that's going to alleviate the problem, not perpetuate the problem. So I want to try something new and recognize and offer that sense of recognition. With open borders, with two sovereign states, there'll be a nation of Israel and a nation of Palestine. Settlers can stay where they are, but they won't be settlers. They'll be Israeli citizens and legal residents of Palestine, if there is a Palestinian state. Palestinians can move to Israel, therefore addressing the law of return. How many will be adjusted? There are discussions about all these matters. But Palestinians could live in Israel. In Israel, they will be citizens of Palestine and legal residents of Israel. And for all we know, because these things are there are plans. There are people at the Van Leer Institute who are working daily on proposals that will deal with all sorts of elements, economic elements, water issues, all these voting rights. You know, if you're a legal resident, maybe you can be the mayor of the town. Maybe a Jew could be the mayor of a Palestinian town in some time. And a Palestinian, it's not unheard of, right? It happens in Israel already. Will be the mayor of an Israeli town. So the Israelis, the Jews who continue to live on the West Bank will cease to be settlers if they choose to remain. Palestinians who return to Palestine will have an option. They'll have an option to live in Palestine or to live anywhere in Israel as legal residents. As I said, there's a gradual process, an attempt to keep the numbers reasonable. Each state will have political integrity, and refugees. And that's also a question: how many refugees? All right, but refugees who don't opt to return will be given monetary compensation. Right? That I think we knew from the beginning. Jerusalem, Al-Quds, will be known as Jerusalem and Al-Quds. Anyone know what Al-Quds is? Those of you with some minimal Hebrew? What's the root of Quds? Quds is spelled, I know that's the brigade, the terrorist brigade, but what Quds is spelled Q-U-D-S. What does it sound like? Those of you who know some Hebrew? Excuse me? Kadosh. It's the Hebrew word Kadosh. Al-Quds is the holy. What's Al-Quds? It's Jerusalem. Okay. So I taught at Al-Quds University. So Jerusalem will be a shared capital. Both Jerusalem is part of the identity of both peoples. A striking example of the interwoven population, of the impossibility of separating the Palestinians from the Jews. We share, even now, with all the tension, we understand, right, that we share a history in this city. We have to work out an arrangement for a joint municipality, a shared government. An example is a joint area of Brussels. I mean, there are examples in the European Union for this type of, for these options of open borders and national sovereignty. Shared security. I mentioned this already. Only Jewish forces in Israel, only Palestinian forces in Palestine. Very important. Jewish forces, the IDF, will no longer be raiding houses on the West Bank, but cooperation. Join forces at the outer borders. Both need to sign a mutual defense treaty, agreement to refrain from hostile activities, and an extradition arrangement. No one of the two countries, Palestine or Israel, can become a sanctuary for criminals who perpetrated some evil, some terror, some violence in the other territory. The implication for Israel is to allow Palestinians to develop a civil identity and pave the way for attaining equal status, access to land, shared power, and Arabic as an official language. You all know, I know we all sat silently by. Do you know this? That a national law was passed in Israel a number of years ago. and Arabic, which was once the second official language of Israel, was demoted. How do you imagine, what do you think the message was to the Palestinians when you demote their language? This was part of the fabric of Israel, that there was a second language operative in Israel, officially recognized by the government. No longer, because the government declared that everything from the river to the sea, there's only one nationality between the river and the sea. And that's not the slogan of the Palestinians. That's the slogan of the Israeli government. The Palestinians borrowed it from us, the demonstrators. That's sort of my cynical understanding of what's going on. All right? Now, there's no solution. This is a hard one, and I don't have an answer for this, but I know that there's a representative on the board of A Land for All, but there's no solution to the conflict without Gaza. So at some point, I mean, this is an obstacle. This has to be addressed. Okay? And finally, in the course of the laying out the plans of this new effort, this is a main principle of this effort. Injustice will not be repaired by another injustice. In other words, we have to understand Israel is not folding up. You can't repair the perceived injustice to the Palestinians by abolishing the state of Israel. And you can't abolish the Palestinian identity for the sake of the perpetuation of the national identity and sovereignty of Israel. This effort requires a paradigm shift. Instead of violence and force, it's partnership between equals. Need to develop shared institutions, a process for resolving differences. There needs to be a high court, right? There are going to be local courts, and there should be a shared high court to decide on fundamental differences, something akin to what exists in the European Union, to guarantee basic rights. Central principle: nothing in the final arrangement should cause harm to either side, as I just said. If you say that this is unrealistic, well, I think we have to say maybe, but it has an advantage over the two-state separation agreement, because there's no forced displacement and no denial of rights. In other words, according to the separation notion of two states, at least 80,000, I think, is it true? 80,000 Israeli settlers will be forced to live elsewhere, and that's never going to happen. All right? So this requires no displacement, no denial of rights. Number two, it's more ethical, because it's based on justice, partnership, and equality. When I heard this, I said, my goodness, these are the very slogans before Gaza. For 25 years, I've been listening to Palestinians and their supporters on campus and constantly proclaim justice, justice for the Palestinians. And justice for the Palestinians meant the abolishment of the State of Israel. But here we come back to them and say, this is justice. This is equality. This is what you've been demonstrating for. We have an answer. And by the way, our goal is not to convince on campus the extremists to reject Israel. Our goal is to convince the third party that's standing by and listening and saying a plague on both your houses. Because neither one of you has a plan to live with one another in the future. So it's our obligation to come forward with a plan. They have no plan. Believe me, the only plan that you hear in the encampments is destroy Israel. If that's, or one state, whatever they mean. Whatever they mean, because they say they're nonviolent. Look, I don't know. But they have no plan. They don't want peace. They don't think about peace. Everybody around us, the Americans, the government, they want to hear Jews and Palestinians, but Jews, we're Jews. They want to hear us talking about peace. We're talking about war, not peace. When they hear talking about war, they get disillusioned. We got to start talking about the possibilities of peace. Change the conversation. Give people a sense of hope. Let them understand why they need to support Israel. Not because it's a warring nation, because it has a vision of coexistence for two people, something that's a dream, but a dream that needs to be fulfilled. It better serves this plan the essential interests of both peoples to preserve a connection to the entire land. As a Zionist, I can walk near the Jordan, I can walk near the Mediterranean. As a Palestinian, I can walk in all the land. The land itself is something that my ancestors, all of our ancestors, lived in. It calls on all who want to live in peace to work constructively for the common good. The goal is to build an Israeli-Palestinian political force that can push both peoples toward partnership. What I love about Eretz L'Kulam, the first time that I'm working on a joint Palestinian-Jewish political movement for peace and coexistence. It gives us hope. There's a constructive vision for the future. As a Jew, it's suffused with the spirit of Zionism and the values of Judaism. And it's a movement based on looking your neighbor in the eye and saying, you are my neighbor, and I'm obligated to love my neighbor as myself. I'm going to end with a story and then take your questions. Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote this in his book about prayer. I've told this before because this is a very compelling story. He was writing about prayer. Why do we pray every day when we know that our prayers aren't always effective? Right? They're not. I know some of you might pray. Do you recognize the fact that sometimes the prayers are not intentional, that they're sometimes mechanical, that we're singing and not thinking, we're not focused? So why continue to pray? So this is Heschel's answer. He said there was a remote town, where all of a sudden the watches in the town started to break down, until finally all the watches and clocks in the town broke down. But there was only one stubborn individual who, in the face of broken down watches and clocks, continued to wind his watch, which told the wrong time. All right. 2 years later, because it was a remote town, the watchmaker came to town. But the only watch that the watchmaker could repair was the watch of the guy who continued to wind his watch. You have to keep on praying, said Heschel, because you never know when the moment is going to come and you're going to be connected. We have to keep on winding the watch of peace and talk about our vision, because if we don't, when it comes, we won't recognize it anymore. It'll pass us by and we'll say it's deviant, it's not real. We won't understand that it's really at our feet. And it's for us to pick it up, to pick up this vision and go with it. Support it with your dollars, support it with your political activities, promote it to your congresspeople, make it something that's going to be discussed publicly in the political world so that we can have a vision of coexistence for the future. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, I'm going to, those of you that need to leave now, fine. If you need to leave at any point, fine. But I'm sure...
What about the dessert? Where's the dessert?
We had dessert earlier.
Oh, earlier.
Sorry. As you heard, Chaim is willing to take some questions. So, who's going to start? Avram Mordechai.
Rabbi Chaim, to see your face is to see the face of God. Thank you so much. This most marvelous presentation of a particular position. You have always been passionate about peace. In all your time at UCLA, as I understand, you reached out to anti-Zionists, you reached out to Palestinians and Goynish. Am I correct? But let me say this further. Where is the person such as you who is in Nablus, who is saying words such as yours?
Okay.
And the people, the Palestinians who are working with Israelis, they are in Israel where there is free speech. I don't think anyone could say what you said, a Palestinian in Nablus, and certainly not in Gaza. What's the solution?
Okay. So first of all, I think you should know it's much worse here than it is on the ground in the Middle East. That there are, of course, Palestinians who are saying this. I told you the whole board of directors that are saying this, and they're about the estimates based on the polling that's done. There are pollsters. About 20% of Palestinians would support such a proposal, and 20% of Israelis. At this time, it's a small percentage in both populations. But you know that basically the two-state solution is being talked about everywhere, and the Israelis are vehemently against the two-state solution to this point. They don't trust to live with the Palestinians. But certainly, I'm not going to report on the Middle East. I can tell you it's much better there. I'm going in a few weeks, so I'll have a better accounting. But you asked me about the campus. So I'm going to give you a couple of answers. Number one, yes, there are people. And it goes back some time. I don't know how many years ago it is already. 2000. It must go back. I don't remember time anymore. It could be 20 years, maybe 15 years. I initiated a class which we taught for 2 years. We had special grant from the chancellor, and there was a lot of politics that opposed this class. The class was called Voices of Peace, Perspectives on Confrontation and Reconciliation in the Arab-Israeli Conflict. We had 85 students. It was the first time that almost half the students were Arab and half the students were Jews. Usually when you tried these efforts on campus, 90% were Jews, and there were a few others in the class. This time it was almost equal because I had a Palestinian partner. He was a student. He had written an article in the Daily Bruin, which I must say I didn't read it all the time. Once in a while I read the Bruin, and you're surprised. It was an excellent article. He talked about the fact that his father grew up on the West Bank. They came and they moved to, and there the Israelis were his enemy. They moved to the San Fernando Valley, and there the Israelis were his friends. And what he realized was, there's not going to be any future unless we can make friends out of the people that we consider to be our enemies. And that's what he wrote in this article. He was the leader of the Arab Student Organization. So as soon as I read that, I sent him an email. And I said, Fadi, you are my brother in peace. And Fadi said to me, what do I do? I want to register, and I helped him register in his organization. We worked together. We helped create this class. That year, the president of Hillel and Fadi sat out on campus at least once a week with a shared table talking about the possibility of coexistence. The students in the class worked on projects together. Fadi had me write his recommendation for the Harvard Law School, where he was accepted. He's a lawyer working in the Valley, and he's now completing a book which is a critique of Muslim society based on nationalism in Islam. So those voices exist, whether the book is going to be, I actually sent the book to a friend of mine who's an editor. He has some academic support and so on. So there's a story. Story number two. A couple of years ago, my friend, professor at UCLA, David Myers, calls me one day and says, Chaim, what are you doing about what's going on campus? I said, David, what's going on campus? I don't know. He said, well, the Muslim students are on campus, or the Muslim students, and they've set up a checkpoint, so the Jews have to pass through a checkpoint. And the Jewish students are standing outside the checkpoint, and they're handing out little slips of paper to anyone who passes through the checkpoint, and the paper says, you're dead. We're suicide bombers. So there was this perverse dance of the Palestinian students and the Jewish students. They were checkpoints, and we were suicide bombers. That's how they did it. So I said, what do I do? So I went into the back office at Hillel, and I said, and I yell out, anybody know where there's any oak tag? So people look at me, what's oak tag? This is oak tag, do you still know what we knew what oak tag was. Now, so the big piece of white cardboard, right? And I said, I found something, and I wrote on it, no to violence, no to the occupation, yes to peace. And I walked out on campus, and I held it up in the middle of all of this, and the students looked at this and said, who's this crazy guy with the white hair? No, the students didn't, I think 90% of the people didn't know who I was. So I stood there, and my hands, I'm not Moses, but my hands were becoming heavier and heavier, and all of a sudden, a student comes up to me and says, can I help you? I said, boy, can you help me? And he took the other side of the cardboard, and we held it up together. So I turned to him, and I said, tell me, what's your name? He said, George. what do you study? I'm a graduate student in electrical engineering. And where are you from, George? He said, Gaza. I can't stand the crazies in my community. We need to create a third voice. So it's not, part of it is, it takes a lot of effort. If I listed for you the occasions on which we brought students together and where I heard from the administration at the university, during those years, the temperature was moderated on campus. It wasn't as if the students fell in love with one another, but they saw each other. And there were opportunities, actually, for joint activities that lessened the tensions. Right? We lost that. Now, we've lost that. There are numerous reasons why we've lost that. That doesn't preclude now we have something that's really terrible, which is we have this policy of boycott, anti-normalization. You don't talk to other people. But I think, I didn't mention this before, you know, by the way, that the Jews have their own boycott. The Hillel policy is, we do not talk to any organization or individual representing an organization that supports BDS. So I always said, I'm not the Hillel director any longer. So I come into Hillel, I said, tell me something. How come there's no debate about BDS? Invite someone who has the other opinion. Let them debate. What's the problem? There's no debate. You're not allowed to do that. You can't invite, many Hillels don't invite any representatives of Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence is a group of former military officers on both sides, Jews who served in the Israeli military and Palestinians who served in the Palestinian PLO or who were terrorists or what, and who've decided to abandon militarism and work together towards peace. So this is considered to be out of bounds, right? Because they report, because they're involved in reporting and criticizing, on reporting of offenses and violations on the part of the Israeli army and so on, whatever. So many Hillels do not invite or cannot. I don't know that Breaking the Silence is invited these days. So you have an operational mode that somehow militates against the type of cooperation that we need in order to change the environment on campus. And we say, basically, the people who are looking from the outside say a plague on both your houses. And what you have is increasing numbers. This really is trouble. Increasing numbers of Jewish students who opt for Jewish Voice for Peace. So, I met with students, and they tell me, oh, we were at the Seder last week in the encampment. There was a Seder in the encampment, and like there was at Columbia, and there was and so on, and in the middle of it, and then I said to the student, I said, yes, there was a Seder, but you know what? When they left the encampment, there was a square right in front of Royce Hall where there was a little piece of it was like a little carpet or something, and on that carpet it said, there was a Magen David, and on the carpet, on both ends of the carpet, it said, step here. So I said, the encampment, there was a Seder, but people were stepping on a Magen David. Oh, well, an individual brought that into the encampment. So you understand, this is bad. It's a bad time. There aren't any voices who are trying to bring the people together. There are only voices who are further dividing the groups. The speakers who come to teach, to do what they call advocacy training. Advocacy training means training the Jewish students that you're right and they're wrong. Not how can we find a way to talk to them even if they're wrong. They don't need to be right in order for me to talk to them. But advocacy is we win, they lose. We haven't gotten over that and understand that fails completely. It doesn't achieve anything. It makes you feel good because we got them. That's what we have. We have a journal. That's what we're doing. So my answer to you is that your analysis, you're not wrong in the fact that there aren't voices. I don't know of too many Jewish voices that reflect what I'm saying. I do know groups of students who do. I have some contact with them. But those students who are saying what I'm saying here, you want to know the truth? They don't come to Hillel. Because Hillel is not a place where they feel comfortable. How's that? That the Jewish organization on campus is not a place where students with a deviant view feel comfortable. What have we done to ourselves? Those are the students that I used to look for. They're the most interesting students because they were able to have an independent opinion. Some of them became rabbis. You know, you just have to talk to people. You have to talk to your own people. I mean, that's the thing, who are different from you, let alone, and we have to do that. That's what, by the way, that's where we should start. We should start talking to Jews who have different points of view. We don't even do that before we start talking to Palestinians. You know, we haven't gotten that straight. So we have a lot of work to do. Yes, you want to call a few more questions?
Yeah, and I'm going to keep an eye on the watch. Okay. We'll go for 10 more minutes, okay? So, and there are a lot of hands here. I'm going to, all right, so Philip, and please keep your questions short. Questions, not speeches.
Was that, you thought I was going to give a speech? Everybody. Okay. First of all, when did you start at UCLA in Hillel? What? Okay, I predated you. I graduated from UCLA. Okay, here's my question. I recently got involved with Standing Together. Are you involved with Standing Together? Okay, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Use a microphone.
Yes, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because the answer, actually, to your question, Avram Mordechai, right, is Standing Together. Standing Together is a civil society group, not a political group, and they've begun to organize here in the United States. They appear weekly on campus. They sit at a table on Bruin Walk, and the problem is the last couple of times that I've gone out to meet with them, they weren't there. So they've been there only a couple of times, but they're made up, Standing Together, Palestinian American and an Israeli American, Jewish American, who stand together. They are part of a movement in Israel, within the boundaries of Israel. This does not involve the West Bank. As I said, it's not a political peace movement, but it's a social movement that's promoting coexistence, not only cooperation, in an effort to move Israeli society from distrust to trust, because that's where we need to go. From the lack of trust that we have for Palestinians as Jews to understanding that they're our neighbors and that we have to know how to work together. And they've been extremely successful. They did 2 tours of the United States. They had large audiences. There were articles about them in all the major newspapers. So look out for them. I'm glad you mentioned them. In Hebrew, Omdim B'Yachad. Omdim B'Yachad, standing together, and they're really important. Toda Rabba Lecha. Thank you. My deficiency.
Rabbi Ira? You had your hand up.
Okay. This is in part a statement, so I ended with, do you agree? First of all, thank you. You articulated almost as better than anybody else I've ever heard. Ideals I embrace. But I have a problem with your plan. How do we get from here to there? I question whether your 2 states, which are really moved very close to a binational state, satisfy the legitimate national aspirations of both Palestinians and Israelis. Why not think in terms of 2 independent states without the, at least at the beginning, without the covering institution that compromises and minimizes the independence of both? Palestinian state, you sort of brush by Gaza. That's very, very familiar. You don't have to do that anymore. We know from the chants we hear in the streets that Gaza is part of Palestine. So Gaza becomes the state of Palestine. What about the West Bank? You said it yourself. Where is the only place where there's integration of Israelis and Palestinians? Inside the Green Line. Eliminate the Green Line. Have Israel annex the entire West Bank. That's a dirty word, and it's a risk. But annexation also means extending what exists inside Israel proper throughout the West Bank, so that the Palestinians there no longer are subjected to, the same law applies, and your police force can apply. In time, what you have projected and envisioned might happen, but I think that the separate states are the place to start.
I have to say that I'm not a politician, and I'm not a political scientist, and I really believe me, there are political scientists and analysts working on this, but I have to tell you this. This is what I've heard. The Palestinians have a national aspiration like the Jews have. You recognize this. And no matter what you say, the idea that even having the vote, even though there are many Palestinians who have said that they're willing to accept the Israeli jurisdiction as long as they have the vote, right? And as long as they have equal citizenship. Nevertheless, what we've been led to understand from the people who founded this Eretz L'Kulam is that the Palestinian national aspiration will not be satisfied by the Palestinians being absorbed as part of an overwhelming Israeli democracy. I mean, we're caught here. We're caught in a bind because your plan, in a way, is a democratic plan. Extend the vote, extend their rights. The problem, of course, is that they'll say that was not the original intention of the United Nations partition plan. And we want a nation like you have a nation. Look at what we're facing in the world today. The world is telling us that the Jews don't deserve a state. And we consider that to be anti-Semitic when they don't allow us to have a state. How can we tell the Palestinians? Though they have called Gaza. Yes, but you know what? But the state of Gaza is currently ruled by Hamas, and that's a problem. Yeah, well, all right. So if you can do that, then you're a magician, and then you can make peace with all the Palestinians. All right. So look, we have to leave it. The way I relate to this is, as I told you, it's a vision. I was once having a discussion. We were on a phone call with one of the founders of A Land for All. She's a political scientist. She actually wrote a very good book now. I'm forgetting its title. Limor Yehuda is her name. And I said, in passing, you know what? I'm doing this because I hope that my grandchildren or whatever, that in future generations, they'll be able to benefit. She became irate. She said, future generations, we want it now. So in other words, this is a passionate Israeli who understands, I want to be able to live in peace with my neighbors. So who am I to tell them not to have this dream? When I see this dream, it's a dream of justice. That's what I like about it. It really moves the arc under which we've been operating very differently from anything before it. But thank you for your question. Of course, it's a problem.
Okay. Folks, I said we were going to stop at 9:15. We're going to stop here. I want to, on behalf of all of us, Chaim, thank you for, such a powerful presentation tonight. And I'm sure that there was everybody here is going to be leaving thinking, which you always have managed to do. You make us think. And we're so grateful to you for your passion and for challenging and for the hope that you gave us tonight. So. Thank you all for being here.